Right, this morning we've got Desmond Woods, Lieutenant Commander Desmond Woods, AIM, RAN. Desmond's been a regular presenter here, including the battles of the Atlantic, the Falklands War, and what an outstanding career spanning 45 years. Royal New Zealand Navy, the Royal Navy. Then there was a bit of an adventure into the Army, then back into the Royal Australian Navy. Lots of interesting and challenging assignments. And today it's all about our Fleet Air Arm, 75th anniversary of the RAN. That in 75 years ago, the Navy became responsible for its own aviation rather than the Air Force. And at the end, you'll talk about this new book, Flying Stations. If you haven't been down to the museum there, it's well worth a look, and lots of photographs in the book to bring it all to life. So over to you, Desmond.
Thank you very much, Noel, and thank you for the opportunity once again to talk to such a very knowledgeable audience. That many of the things I will say will be very well known to you. Indeed, many of you may have taken part in these events. So when it comes to question time, you can put me right if I got anything wrong. I really appreciate the chance to give this presentation a second time. I put it together for the Australian Naval Institute seminar 10 days ago down at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, where first Commodore David Frost spoke, then I did, and then Captain Todd Glenn spoke about the future of the Fleet Air Arm. Then we went through to the Fleet Air Arm Museum itself and stood in front of a tracker, and Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, former Chief of Navy, launched the book, easily our most senior living aviator. So here we are, starting this presentation today with a quote. Navy does not drop from the clouds. It is a miraculous and delicate instrument, a creation of nerves as well as steel, united with blood as well as rivets. It is in many ways the greatest expression of a naval nation's genius. Now, who wrote that and why? Admiral Sir Lewis Keppel Hamilton, Royal Navy, was our last RN Chief of Naval Staff. And he was writing in 1945 to 48. I think he probably wrote this in 48. He was getting frustrated with the way that the government of the day didn't seem to quite understand the significance of naval aviation. He'd been Flag Officer Malta through the last part of the Siege of Malta. He fully understood the significance of naval aviation and aircraft's impact on what's going on ashore. And he was determined that before he left, he would make sure that the RAN was properly fitted, as he saw it, for a future war in the Pacific. Ben Chifley, the Prime Minister, was lobbied by the Royal Australian Air Force, who took the view that if anything flew, it must obviously belong to them. The Navy took the alternative view, which was that squadrons are part of the ship. They're not something that just flies on and flies off. They're not a weapon that you just drop on the deck. They are integral to the way in which a ship operates. And Ben Chifley took this and said, the squadrons embarked in an aircraft carrier form part of the organization of the ship. They're not passengers. The whole reason for the carrier is the employment of air power in support of operations. Therefore, the status and control of Navy aviation will be in accordance with the Navy's plan. So that was a rebuff to the Royal Australian Air Force. A rebuff that they took so seriously that 75 years later, they still aren't flying from our decks where we actually need them to be. However, that's a part of the story that comes later. It wasn't as though there weren't plenty of RAN VR aircrew who had flown with the Royal Navy during the Second World War. There were experienced RAN aircrew to train the next generation of pilots and observers. And of course, there was a whole cadre of air engineers and mechanics as well. So it wasn't starting from a tabula rasa. It was very much, what are we going to do with all these people who know what to do? Just a matter of finding them a carrier to do it from. During the Second World War, for example, a young Lieutenant Victor Alfred Trumper Smith, as an observer, flew his squadron from Scotland into action against Shandhorse off Norway. The first time in the history of warfare that a ship at sea was attacked from the air. They didn't score any hits and they didn't lose any aircraft, so it was 0-0. Matt Smith got back and was awarded a mention in dispatches. And that, of course, becomes in many ways the father of the Australian Fleet Air Arm. There were other things that were happening as well. Here's a painting of HMS Perth's Seagull 5 shot down over Crete by a couple of Dorniers that caught up with it. Fortunately, they got into the water. They were able to fly some signal flares, and HMS Havoc came along and rescued the two crew. There are many other stories as well of air crew that were taken from the sea, including Vat Smith himself. Here's an example. RANVR pilot Lieutenant Charles Sprague Lee. He was in on the raid on the Italian battle fleet at Taranto in 41, which opened an entire new chapter of naval aviation. He flew through intense fire and he scored a direct broadside strike on an Italian battleship and survived to tell the tale. That's an extraordinary story that very few people know, and was decorated for it. Churchill, of course, was obsessed with what he called the beast, turbot. If turbot got out into the broad Atlantic, there would have been hell to pay, or if it got in amongst the northern Murmansk convoys taking supplies to Russia. And so Churchill was obsessed with getting rid of turbots. And as you know, the midget submarines made their attempt and certainly disabled her. And then the Fleet Air Arm were given their chance in Operation Tungsten on the 3rd of April 44. And there were RAN pilots and aircrew involved in that. And Gledhill got a bomb onto Turpitz' A turret from his Barracuda, and he was quite rightly decorated for that. 120 of the ship's company of Turpitz were killed in that raid, and a ship is not just blood, it's not just rivets, it's blood also. So in 1944, there were 24 RAAF fighter pilots who volunteered to transfer to the RANVR, and then they flew from RN carriers in the Pacific. So these were by the time the war was over and Chifley was making his decisions, they were also available to continue their careers, not in the Air Force, but in the Navy. And you may well have met some of these dear gentlemen in the last years of their lives, which were quite recent. So they were also available. You'll probably remember the American who was on board a British aircraft carrier, and he noted the fact that with armored decks, British aircraft carriers were far less vulnerable to kamikazes than the American wooden decked aircraft. And he made the remark that in the case of a British aircraft carrier, it was a case of sweepers man your brooms after a kamikaze had hit the deck. So there's the British Pacific Fleet there. You notice the way that the roundel was extended so that American pilots couldn't think that they were looking at a Japanese rising sun. There's Indomitable coming into the Captain Cook graving dock, one of the very first ships ever to dock there. So there was no question that we could support carriers here. We'd been doing so for the RN during the last 2 years of the war. The other thing, of course, that the RN brought out during the last part of the war was the aviation capability ashore. First of all was RAAF base Nowra, then it was called HMS Nabington, and it was a Royal Navy Mobile Naval Air Base, a MONAB. The supposition was that the war was going to go on well into 1946. More and more RN carriers were going to come out, and what became Albatross was to be a major fleet, a Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm base. And of course, in 1945, all that came to an end. For some reason, best known to themselves, the ship was once again renamed Nabswick. And you can see an image there of men and only men marching through the streets of Nowra. That church is still there. So the Royal Navy's armored deck carriers, as I just mentioned, had proved themselves in the Pacific War, and there were plenty of them unfinished in yards, which were waiting for buyers when the war finished unexpectedly in 45. So bargains were to be had, and one of them was HMS Terrible, renamed HMAS Sydney, bought by the Australian government and finished, was commissioned in Britain in December 48, and this is the RAN's first aircraft carrier. 805 and 816 squadrons were embarked. She was a classic World War II carrier, straight decked. And of course, in addition to the need for ships and decks, you need people to fly off them. So here's the #1 course, pilot's class 1948 at Point Cook. And there's the flying instructor who was a bit of an ace from World War II, Fred Lane. And he was a very inspirational figure in the early years of the Fleet Air Arm. What were they going to fly? Well, RAN Fairey Fireflies and Sea Furies. So there's the Firefly there. It was intended for surface attack on land or at sea, a very capable aircraft, fast piston engine aircraft, and with a good range of capability for attacking surface targets in particular. And then the Firefly, of course, was intended to take on squadrons of incoming fighters attacking a convoy or a task group. And they were the fastest Fleet Air Arm piston engine aircraft that the RAN or the RAN ever had. And as you can see from the map in the top corner, they were used to fly over Korea. HMS Glory and HMAS Sydney both flew them. And 808 Squadron set a light fleet carrier record by flying 89 sorties off in one day. The main task, of course, was always to protect the ship itself, but that was easily done by a small number of aircraft. The rest of the time, aircraft were flying off Sydney and attacking shipping, roads, bridges, indeed trains. It was a conspicuously successful way of projecting air power ashore in support of UN troops, including, of course, Australians and British, and the Commonwealth troops were there. One of the most significant firsts was the first rescue of a Firefly aircrew by a helicopter behind North Korean lines. Happened in 26th of October, 51. The pilot, Neil McMillan, was told by his petty officer, Phil Hancock, that the flak they'd just taken had started a small fire, which was very likely to blow them to pieces in midair. So McMillan lifted his wheels and came in for a belly landing. They both got out safely, having given an indication of where they were, and a helicopter from a Sikorsky helicopter from Sydney flew to the rescue and got to them just as North Korean troops were about to arrive at the site. Undoubtedly, they saved both their lives, and it really is the beginning of the concept we now have, of course, which is that wherever our people go down, we're there to fish them out of the drink or get them back to the ship. And of course, the weather in that winter in beginning of 52, January 52, was just awful. And you can see there the angle of heel on the deck. Ships, air carriers simply can't operate in those conditions. And there was quite a long patch of time when both the Fireflies and the Sea Furies couldn't operate. And there wasn't room for all of them to be struck down below. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have done so. And of course, there were fatalities. Lieutenant Keith Clarkson was struck by enemy fire while diving on a road convoy. Sub-Lieutenant Ronald Coleman was disappeared in a cloud, and he was never seen again. And Sub-Lieutenant Richard Sinclair was particularly unlucky. He was hit by flak, his aircraft caught fire, forcing him to bail out, and he was killed when he was struck by the tailplane of his own aircraft as he disappeared over the back of the aircraft. Very unlucky. And of course, that wasn't the only way in which people were losing their lives. Straight deck carriers were dangerous. You either piled into the deck park on the bow of the ship, or you went over the bow and the ship went over you. Either way, it was not good. And so Sydney was operating in Jervis Bay, training air crew from Albatross, and there were accidents. There are a lot of aircraft down at the bottom of Jervis Bay, some of them still, of course, with human remains, most not. Mostly they were saved, but it didn't always happen. What else was going on? Well, there was a very large contingent of RAAF there at Albatross because they were part of the AJAS, the anti-submarine school. at the air station at Nowra from 1951 all the way through to 1990. They were there. And as you can see, there's a Lincoln bomber there, which was used for ASW work in support of SEATO and ANZUC. There were major exercises run in Southeast Asia, and the home base for them was back at Nowra. Burning of Spitfires, 1952. No, this isn't an urban myth, it really happened. 14 ex-RAAF World War II Spitfires in flying order were used for aircraft handler training on the dummy deck, which you can see there. Each one was then taken away to the fire ground to be burnt to give fire crews training in extinguishing aircraft fires. The past is another country. They do things differently there. Can you imagine if Australia had just put them all in a hangar and locked the door and kept them all these years? They would now be not only the best example of an extant squadron of Spitfires left anywhere in the world, they would also have been of tremendous monetary value as well. But that's not how people thought in those days. The war was over, jet aircraft had arrived. What would you want these old piston engine things for? Get rid of them, put them to some practical use, use them for teaching people how to put out fires. Sad, but true. British nuclear tests in the Montebello Islands off northwest WA. 805 and 816 Squadron maintained a security radius of 72 km around the test site to make sure that no aircraft intruded accidentally into the test site. First RAN helicopters arrived in 53 with HMS, then HMAS Vengeance. This was the carrier that came out from Britain to supplement Sydney while they were waiting for Melbourne to be commissioned. And the theory was that there were always going to be two carriers, Sydney plus Melbourne, and this was Sydney plus Vengeance. And 3 RAN Sycamore helicopters came out. You can see the date written in sailors, Elizabeth R, 1954 on the flight deck there. 13 Sycamores altogether were bought by the RAN and 7 were lost in accidents, which tells you something about both the aircraft itself and the dangers of it. OH&S was not much of a feature of life in those days. This is a bloke hanging out of an aircraft, getting ready to be dressed up to pretend to be a witch coming in for to amuse children at the air show. That's what I was told when I showed this photograph to those that know. There's a Sycamore blade change going on using men's backs as a rest for the rotor blade. And Melbourne was finally commissioned in UK in 28th of October 1955, but by then the decision had been made that there would only ever be one extant strike carrier. Sydney was not to be converted to an angle deck aircraft carrier and brought up to the standard of Melbourne. There wasn't the money, there wasn't the enthusiasm, and as usual, the RAAF wasn't in favour of flying at sea, so doing everything they could to stop that from happening. But there you can see the angle flight deck, which transformed the prospects of surviving a landing which didn't end as well as you'd have wished, because you could go round again. Hugely important. The other great thing, of course, was the mirror landing system, which the British also invented, which gave the pilot a clear understanding of what his height was relative to the deck and when he needed to make that final drop onto the deck on his final approach. That also meant that he was very likely to pick up with his tail hook the wires stretched across the deck and not miss them and have to go round again. So they worked in combination, the angle flight deck, the mirror landing sites and the arrestor wires to make it a much safer thing to do. Strange things happened in those days. The Fleet Air Arm was called upon to take off and shoot down an Oster light aircraft, which had somehow managed to take off without its pilot from a little airport near Sydney, and was doing lazy circles around Sydney and threatening to come down on the city. The RAAF was sent off with Meteors, but for some reason they couldn't get it. And so 2 RAN Sea Furies from 805 Squadron, 2 RN pilots on loan, opened fire once the aircraft was over water and sent the pilotless plane into the sea. And there they are there reenacting the moment for the photographer. 1955. Sea Furies and Fireflies were phased out, and one aircraft was brought in to do both jobs. This was the RAN's first jet fighter, the de Havilland Sea Venom, started arriving in 1954. About 100 were bought overall, Sea Venoms and Sea Vampires. And some of you, like me, will be old enough to remember the distinctive tail boom that one used to see when you were a boy or a girl in the sky around your hometown. Certainly, I was living in Auckland as a boy, and the RNZAF had them as well, and they flew them over Auckland fairly regularly. They were very distinctive aircraft and very good aircraft in many ways. There they are again there. So it was a fast all-weather jet interceptor, and it was more than capable of taking on MiGs and other opposition had it ever been put to it. You can see one there on Melbourne's deck. Of course, they were not without fatalities either, and the bearded chap in the foreground there, Carmichael was his name, he and one other were killed in a crash. We've recently had the funeral of another observer who died very recently, having won his Martin Baker ejector seat tie for a night landing, which went spectacularly badly. And he and his pilot both bailed out and both survived. And then he went on to live another 55, 60 years. The other aircraft that was brought in, of course, was the Fairey Gannet with its unique counter-rotating prop. 34 were bought for the RAN in 56, and they arrived with Melbourne. And a succession of aircraft came out, each an improvement on the last. And on each occasion, they would be bought in Britain from Fairey, and pilots would be flown over there or sailed over there, I presume, to train in them. And then they brought them out next time a carrier was coming out. So that was a very good example of the kind of interoperability that existed at that time, and was a very considerable component of the RAN's success, having the larger Navy, the RN, to train with and to get aircraft from. It was a steady surveillance platform. It had a good long range for its day, and of course, long endurance. And that's what you need in anything that's providing you with ASW capability. You need something that can get out as far as possible from the task force that it's protecting and is going to warn of incoming hostile aircraft, and then stay there for as long as possible. And that's what was done. They were very good indeed. So there you are. There's a combination of RAN ASW Gannets armed with rockets and torpedoes, struck down in Melbourne's hangar on her flight deck, and that looks like the Royal Yacht in the background there. And of course, the folding wings made it the ideal aircraft for being able to strike down so that it could fit into the hangar deck. It had a speed of 311 miles per hour, nautical range of 662 miles. So, as I said, good speed, good range. Sea Venoms and Gannets there on one small aircraft carrier. Quite extraordinary how many aircraft Melbourne could carry. Mountbatten came out when I think he was first Sea Lord, before he became Chief of Defence Staff, and he described HMS Albatross as the smartest air station I have ever seen of any type, in any service, in any country. Well, he was obviously trying to please his hosts, but Mountbatten was a man who knew a thing or two about how an air station should look, and he was very impressed with Albatross. In addition to the fixed-wing Sea Venoms and the Gannets, the Fleet Air Arm also operated Douglas Dakotas, 4 of them, XRAAF ones, and they had those from the mid-50s till the mid-70s. And many of you will have flown in Douglas Dakotas, best described as 40,000 rivets attempting to keep rough formation in the air. They were noisy and they were bouncy, but they did the job. They were reliable. Skipping forward to 1967, we have the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, which, as you know, is composed of both US Army and RAN personnel. It was considered an experimental military unit, hence its call sign EMU, which was, of course, ideal for an Australian manned military unit. And it went in contingents, one after another. We shouldn't forget that Sydney was recommissioned as the Vung Tau ferry to carry the army and its equipment and people to Vietnam on many, many occasions. And of course, aircraft were carried on board, though they couldn't be flown, generally speaking, until such time as the army cleared all its trucks and equipment off the flight deck. Then it could be. And as you can see there was also a Chinook, and there were Iroquois, and there were Wessex. There was a fatal training accident of people getting ready to go to Vietnam, 5th of June, 68. 3 members of 73 Squadron, Peter Ward, Sanderson, and Smith, were killed when their Iroquois crashed over the cliff at Beecroft Head firing range into the sea. They just landed a 4th crew member, Lieutenant Robert Ray, and Captain Robert Ray was at this presentation 10 days ago when he came down to be present for the launch of the book Flying Stations. And so he has lived another over 50 years. Extraordinary. Get the Bloody Job Done was not only the squadron or the experimental unit name, but of course it's also something that's lived on in the legends of the Fleet Air Arm, because so much was done in order to try to provide assault and rescue right through that whole long period in Vietnam. There was also a detachment with 9 Squadron RAAF, which did very well. They were flying their Iroquois with them, and there was an air mobile and gunship support for ground operations. And again, the Fleet Air Arm fitted in beautifully with its sister service, the RAAF, and everyone flew together very happily. The people who really are the unsung heroes of the whole period in Vietnam in many ways are the Fleet Air Arm maintainers, who repaired battle-damaged aircraft and engines in the most extreme conditions, frequently being required to move from the location they were in to some other location in Vietnam, seemingly at the whim of those who weren't thinking in terms of the sheer scale of what they were attempting to do. It wasn't just the aircraft that had to be moved, it was all the spares and everything else went with them. And the book on that subject looks into that in great detail. Lieutenant James Buchanan, Distinguished Flying Cross, realized that the patrol boat on the river down below him was drifting towards an enemy-held shore. He pressed the skids of his helicopter onto the deck of the vessel and pushed the boat to safety while his aircraft was receiving fire. Distinguished Flying Cross, pretty well-deserved one as well. 1st of December, 1970. There were other Distinguished Flying Crosses handed out as well, as you can see, and a Distinguished Service Cross for Winston James, who was one of the distinguished leaders of the whole period. And of course, we had our losses, as you can see. Lieutenant Commander Patrick Vickers, Lieutenant Anthony Casadio, Petty Officer O'Brien Phillips, Sub-Lieutenant Anthony Hewlin, and the name that's come down to us most recently, of course, is Noel Shipp, the leading seaman, who was one of the people put forward for consideration for a Victoria Cross a few years ago. Noel was seen as his aircraft was dropping and clearly not going to recover from its the attack that had been made on it from the ground. It was doomed, and Noel was seen to be still firing his waist gun down at the enemy. So he never gave up. He wasn't awarded a VC, but we remember his name. In 1970, Bat Smith was appointed chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee and promoted to admiral. And he went up to Vietnam in person, and there he is there with aircrew, US Army and RAN, I suspect, and Australian Army, just showing his presence there and remembering perhaps himself the dangers of combat aviation. He retired in 1975 as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the equivalent of CDF today, and he wrote in his haul-down report when he was Chief of Naval Staff, air operations at sea require an expertise that can only be developed over many years. It cannot be created or resurrected when war breaks out. So that's the enduring wisdom of Vat Smith, and something that perhaps we should have made up as a plaque and put on the door of every Minister of Defence as they take over in Parliament. The ASW Westland Wessex arrived in '62 and went on flying with us, doing a tremendous job all the way through to '89. 27 were originally ordered and then more later. Some were lost. The majority of them did extremely well. They weren't as big as the later Sea Kings, but at the time, they seemed like a godsend, particularly for search and rescue and for carrying the ASW equipment, the dippers, the dipping sonar, which made them lethal to submarines. The Skyhawk came in, 10 in 1967, 10 more in 1971. And again, these were a very great improvement on the Vampire or the Sea Venom. They were just a lot faster, a lot more capable, could carry a greater payload, and they had Sidewinder, which was, of course, the weapon of choice. They had also had refueling, enabling an extended range flying, which was something new, and it made it possible to put aircraft in the sky and take them much greater distances than any one fuel load could have allowed them to carry. So 4 Sidewinders and air-to-air missiles. And there's the salute to the Sea Venom from the A4 Skyhawks in the background there, saluted by the aircraft that replaced it on the apron at Albatross. Now, the Gannets were replaced by 14 Grumman trackers, and they started arriving from 1967. This was a more capable aircraft than the Gannet. Everything was an improvement in terms of range and speed and capability. A very significant aircraft indeed for ASW work and for general reconnaissance. On the 2nd of June 1969, the USS Frankie Evans turned under Melbourne's bow. There wasn't a thing Melbourne could have done that she didn't do, and the ship was cut in half. Immediately, 817 got into the air, and they picked men up from the water who would otherwise have drowned in the first 35 minutes, and they went on looking for others for 15 hours. And so there was an Air Force cross for that, for the commanding officer of 817, Lieutenant Commander Des Rogers, and a unit citation, meritorious unit citation from the USN for the squadron. Operation Navy Help Darwin, December 1974, Cyclone Tracy. Darwin was just about wiped out. Tom Lewis is online with us, and Tom is the absolute authority on this subject. But one of the things, as I understand it, that the Fleet Air Arm did was to evacuate the Navy families who were stranded there. And that was not just done by helicopter, it was done in the much larger electronic warfare and ECM aircraft, the Hawker Siddeley HS 748s. They had been bought for electronic warfare and ECM training, but they had that capability for picking people up and moving them in bulk. And they used them to bring out 475 civilians from Coonawarra in 14 relief flights. Amazing amount of flying done to get people south and out of harm's way. They went on being used for electronic warfare training, and then also for VIP transport for the RAN right through till 2000. A very capable aircraft indeed. And you can see in the background a couple of trackers there on that screen. So there we are. We've got a modern aircraft carrier, modern in the sense that it's got an angled flight deck, it's flying Skyhawks, it's flying trackers, all being done from what the Americans regarded as an extremely small deck. And that, of course, implied and meant that you had to have very skilled flight deck teams in order to ensure that you didn't have accidents on deck. And that was the case. We had a really competent, capable aircraft carrier, and the people on it. All that was necessary now was to think in terms of which aircraft carrier we were going to get to replace Melbourne. ASW dipping sonar, the Wessex capability was continued with the Sea King from 76 on. When the Sea Kings arrive, the Wessex becomes really a utility helicopter and loses the Sea King, loses the ASW capability. The Sea Kings brought a whole new era in heavy lift capability and ASW. The Royal Navy, of course, had them divided up into what they called the Junglies, which is the Sea Kings intended merely for just for troop transport and insertion, and the ASW ones. We kept them going in both roles as best we could. So what happened to the Wessex? Well, it became a counter-terrorism platform for the army. It was in disaster relief, aid to civil powers, search and rescue, all the things you'd expect of it. And so it flew in tandem with the Sea Kings right through until 89. And one of the things it did was to make it possible for the Special Air Service and other special units to be inserted onto oil and gas platforms in the Bass Strait. There was a strong suspicion that these were vulnerable, and Operation Bursa was the patrolling of Bass Strait by Navy in support of Army Special Forces. And that went on for a decade, and it was intended to deter terrorist attack. And the people who did that have recently, quite rightly, received the ASM, which hadn't been handed out when it could have been years earlier. So there's Melbourne heading for the Silver Jubilee off Spithead with a full mix of modern aircraft and sailors writing silver ER2 on her Jubilee on her flight deck. So all was going well with the Fleet Air Arms capability to maintain fixed wing strike capability at sea. Then, of course, there was something of a setback in that 9 trackers were destroyed by arson. A member of the squadron who was disgruntled actually caused the fire, and he turned off the ability to have the sprinkler system working. And that meant that people had to break off from a wardroom dinner engagement and head down in mess kit to the tracker hangar and do their very best to save what they could, with some success. 6 were saved. Melbourne then sailed to the US in 1978 and brought back replacements, and they brought back more modern replacements. No lives were lost. So it was a disaster of Fleet Air Arm's own making, and it was a profoundly difficult time. But in fact, those trackers were replaced and they were back doing their job within 12 months. So which way now for the Fleet Air Arm? What new deck is going to replace Melbourne in the 1980s to continue naval fixed wing flying and combat air patrols? Nobody could imagine that Melbourne wasn't going to be replaced. It was such an obvious asset, not just to Australia, but to the entire strategic position in the Pacific and elsewhere. USN pilots, as I said, were surprised by how much flying Melbourne did from a relatively small deck, and were suggesting that an Essex class might be just the thing to provide a larger deck space for the RAN. The debate in Australia turned toxic after the Vietnam War. Labor opposition leader Bill Hayden stated that post-Vietnam, the RAN's future was to be only a brown water coastal navy. And that was a view held in both political parties once forward defence was replaced by continental defence as national policy. He wasn't alone in thinking that the era of a blue water navy was over. And then HMAS Melbourne was obviously going to be decommissioned, and the replacement was going to be HMS Invincible. And the Australian government offered to buy Invincible in January 82 only as a helicopter carrier. There was no question of it being a Harrier carrier. And the reason that Invincible was available was the same level of stupidity that was evident here was also evident in the United Kingdom. Arguably the stupidest man ever to become UK Defence Secretary, John Nott, decided that carriers were surplus to the British requirement, and that the one that was being built, Invincible, could be sold, and in due course they'd get rid of Illustrious and Ark Royal as well. And then, to prove how wrong he was, the Falklands happened. And of course, by June 1982, the British public were not going to let Invincible be sold, She had just distinguished herself in combat with the Argentinians and was clearly the way of the future. So 3 Invincibles were to be retained, which meant that it would be embarrassing for the British government if they were now required to sell Invincible as per the terms of the contract to the Fraser government. So knowing this to be the case, Malcolm Fraser got in touch and offered to withdraw the original plan to buy Invincible, and that was gratefully accepted. And in place, Hermes was offered by the UK government for sale or loan to the RAN. How do I know that? I was serving in Hermes at the time, and we had Australian officers on board. And that was what they were there to do, to look at Hermes and check her out and make sure that she was suitable for the task. Now, there was nothing wrong with Hermes. She went on to serve as the INS Virat for another 40 years. The problem was, of course, that neither the RAN nor the RN had the numbers of people to run such a World War II era carrier. The Indians could. They had no shortage with manning those big old Admiralty 3-drum boilers down below, but the RAN would have struggled. And so wisely, the decision was made not to bring Hermes out as a replacement for Melbourne. In the same year, there were Squirrels announced for the new class of FFG, the Oliver Hazard Perry class of ships that were coming out. Had a flight deck, something needed to go on them, and the best aircraft for that was the Squirrels, and there's one there with the new HMAS Adelaide. Back to the story of the carrier. Late in 1983, when the election campaign was going on, Bob Hawke said, quote, "It is an absurdity to waste so much money and invest so much of your scarce resources," it should be scarce, "in an aircraft carrier." Well, that was his opinion. And of course, once he got into power, he said 75 FA-18 Hornet fighter aircraft will be bought as planned for the RAAF. As for your aircraft carrier, you can forget that. So that was Bob Hawke's opinion. Now, he was bolstered in his view that this was the way ahead by the RAAF saying that they didn't want to see 2 air forces continue, and that they didn't want to fly XRAN Skyhawks, but they would provide the anti-air training for the fleet over the coastal areas away from Australia. And that was a promise that was made, but not kept. Instead, because the Fleet Air Arm required somebody was required to do the role, Fleet Air Arm couldn't, the decision was made to give the role to the RNZAF that had taken on not only their own Skyhawks, but some of the ex-Fleet Air Arm ones that had been sold or given to them as well. And they came to Nowra and flew as fleet support for the better part of a decade and did a very fine job indeed. Here's an episode some of you may remember. Lieutenant Jeff Ledger as the rescue pilot up in Singapore on loan service. A derrick from a crane going between Sentosa Island and the mainland cut the cable car cable running between the island and Singapore, and 7 people died when 2 cable cars plunged into the sea, but other cable cars were hung there in midair with people inside. And on a filthy night, Jeff Ledger and a Singaporean pilot went out and did an astounding job of hovering over and lowering people down onto the roofs of the cable car, getting inside and getting people stropped and back up into the aircraft. It was a truly astounding feat and richly deserved a Singapore Military Commendation Medal Silver. So there is some of the aircraft that were flying throughout the 1980s, as you can see there. A wide range of aircraft, much wider than we attempt to do today. And of course, down in the bottom right-hand side over Sydney Opera House was the aircraft that was to take over from many of these, which was, of course, the Seahawk Bravo. It came in 1989. It was state-of-the-art in its day. It extended the combat radius of the ship by finding and attacking surface or submarine targets independently or in conjunction with other forces. It was its interoperability and its capacity to communicate with the ops room on the ship that it flew from that really made it a big jump forward in terms of capability. It could attack with guns, with torpedoes, and of course with rockets, as you see there, for anti-air, from air to air. HMS Tobruk, I've put her in there because in many ways, after Melbourne was decommissioned and before Canimbla and Manura came along, she was the only example of an amphibious capability in the Navy. She did have, as you can see there, 2 flight decks, and that wasn't any kind of a replacement for Melbourne, but it did continue to give people an understanding that aircraft are not just don't just land on frigates, there are other capabilities as well. Gulf War I, February 1991, Lieutenant Commander Peter Bong Nelson won an Air Force Cross while he was on loan service to the Royal Navy. He was flying a Junglee. In driving wind and rain, he flew a Royal Marine Commando Sea King as low as 50 meters above the desert to recover 2 casualties, British soldiers, from a forward dressing station during a tank battle. He was under attack. He was flying in a sandstorm and rainstorm, and he picked up these 2 blokes and brought them back and got them treatment. Richard deserved UK Air Force Cross. So we have the recommissioning of 816 Squadron to operate Seahawk helicopters embarked with Adelaide, 816 helped enforce sanctions against Iraq and took part in the 2003 invasion of Iraq and provided security for the Iraqis' oil exports for 2 decades after that war was over. That's Op Damask. And so 816 has been in the thick of it for all these years and is still going strong. There's the Sydney to Hobart rescue by 817 with the Sea Kings, a major search and rescue effort. Wasn't by any means all fleet air armed. There were lots of helicopters out doing the business. 55 sailors needed to be airlifted to safety and only 6 died, which, considering the conditions and the circumstances in which the aircraft were trying to make the rescues, was a very remarkable effort. 817 Squadron was engaged in SAR for 2 nights in these extreme conditions. There are no real photographs taken because Tansy Lee and the people who were doing it weren't interested in taking photographs. They were interested in getting to the people in the water and getting them saved. And they were operating by night, which was unique because other aircraft could operate by day, but he could operate, the Sea King could operate by night. 723 Squadron has a unique record of having been engaged in Vietnam in 67 through to 71, Kuwait 1991, and East Timor 1999. They did far more with these squirrels than anybody else in the world ever did with them. They weren't just a trainer aircraft. They were very much a fleet asset with a very long career, not to be forgotten. Interfered in October 1999. It was quite extraordinary. Captain James Goldrick wrote how much fleet aviation could achieve ashore during the course of the support for the Australian Army and other forces going in to sort out the mess that the Indonesians army had left in East Timor, and to do something about the scale of depredation that had been done by those who were unhappy that East Timor was going to be independent. 50th anniversary of 817, 1960 to 2000. Painting up an aircraft is not something we do very much these days, but they did back in 2000. And of course, firefighting has gone on year after year throughout this period. The big change was the arrival just in time for the 2002 fires of the Bambi bucket, which could be used to douse a fairly large area of flame simultaneously. There is a story in the book, Flying Stations 2, about a group of Navy airmen from Albatross who joined their local fire brigade, Rural Bush Fire Brigade, and they were trying to save a house somewhere in the area of Albatross. And they were up against a wall of fire, and they couldn't see any hope that they could either retreat into the house and be safe there or run because the fire was coming too fast. And they pretty much decided that it was all over. And at that moment, a Sea King with a Bambi bucket arrived right over their head, dropped a vast quantity of water on the fire, doused it to the point where they could get it under control and escape from the flame themselves. So it really was a game changer and a lifesaver. Here's 817 Squadron crew and maintainers ashore in Iraq in 2003. There's Paul Mogger and Paul Kimlin standing in front of a tiled effigy of Saddam Hussein, probably just before it was blown up by someone, probably the US Marines. And there they are in the desert with their Sea King there. And of course, the maintainers once again did a fantastic job of making sure that aircraft was serviceable and ready for flight each day. Ramsey, the mission to the Solomons, regional aid to Solomon Islands. There's an RAN Sea King at Avu Avu on the remote weather coast of Guadalcanal, obviously lifting a Land Rover to where it needs to go. One of the jobs the Fleet Air Arm was doing was supporting the establishment of police posts to try to get on top of the random violence that was going on, led by Heke and the other insurgents. The Firebolt incident of the 24th of April 2003, Iraqi Dow came up alongside a boat that the USS Firebolt had sent off a rib and was going to intercept, and then decided to actually blow it up. And that's what they did, causing USN deaths. And Ben Syme was in the helicopter that was nearest to it, and he saw the problem, and in his flight suit, he jumped into the water, rendered assistance, turned over an individual and tried to give him first aid. It was night, he said, so it was a little bit challenging. All I could do was just support him as best I could and keep his head out of the water, which he succeeded in doing for the better part of 30 minutes until a rib from the ship could get out and rescue him. It was an amazing achievement, and he rightly won a Medal of Gallantry for it. And he is now Lieutenant Commander Ben Syme. I met him 10 days ago. The Cayman Super Sea Sprite story. Well, I haven't got time to go into all that here and now. There's an entire chapter of it in the book provided by Rear Admiral Tony Dalton, who was with the project from the beginning to the end. It was a problem of getting the automatic flight control system to operate in such a way that it could make the aircraft safe to fly. Flights were made, but eventually the decision was made that to persevere with the program was going to be even more expensive. And in 2008, a $1 billion program was cancelled, leaving the Fleet Air Arm without an aircraft that had forward-looking infrared, FLIR, and without the capability to do what the Super Sea Sprite was intended to do. Sumatra Assist, January to February 2005. We all remember the scale of the loss of life in Aceh. There's a photograph showing why so many lives were lost. But of course, there were plenty of other lives that needed to be saved after the Boxing Day tsunami. And the Navy went up there with Canimbla, and Sea King were flying each day, helping the Army to get their engineers ashore, trying to restore services to Aceh, and doing an extremely valuable job. And they did that for as long as it took. And then they were withdrawn, and Canimbla was on her way home when she was alerted to the fact that on the island of Nias, there was another earthquake, and once again, there was a need for help. Shark 02 went to help, and amongst other things was carrying gas bottles on board. A split pin that should never have been reused was in the flying control mechanism. It snapped at the critical moment when the aircraft was coming into land, and the combination of the crash and the gas bottles caused the loss of life of 9 ADF, not all RAN, while delivering humanitarian aid to the earthquake victims. And that was a disaster from the point of view of the Fleet Air Arm, all the families involved, and of course is something that lives in the memory of all of us who who first heard about it when it happened. David Hurley said, a tragic accident has taken 9 fine Australians from us. We must carry the grief. We must also carry the intense pride that in time may make it bearable. And I think that's probably the best summation of as what has happened in the years since 2005. Prime Minister Howard announced the purchase of 2 Spanish Juan Carlos class LHDs, landing helicopter decks. They were, of course, designed by the Spanish to be short takeoff and vertical launch Harrier carriers, or, as they now are, F-35 Bravo Joint Strike Fighter carriers. But the decision was made from the beginning that under no circumstances were we going to have F-35 Bravos or Harriers, and that we weren't going to be flying our own aircraft from them. Therefore, we were never going to need the capability to refuel or look after anybody else's F-35Bs as well. So all the equipment that should have gone into these aircraft to fulfill their potential as Harrier carriers was deliberately left off. And it would now be very expensive indeed to put all that back in again. Indeed, when the design was let, the contract was let, the question was asked, is it possible to take off that ski jump on the bow? Because we're never going to use that. And the designers and the contractors, Avantia, said, no, can't do that. That's part of the stability of the ship. It's built in. So reluctantly, it was left there as a permanent reminder of what these aircraft carriers were intended to do, much more than just be a landing helicopter dock. The 723 Squadron, working with the Augusta, which was the replacement for the Squirrel in many ways, certainly complemented it. And there you can see it there doing a job of working with submarines, with light ships, and with Armidale-class patrol boat. And there's Kanimbla and Manura. I think that's Kanimbla there. As I said earlier, they helped to keep alive the idea of multi-spot landings. And then Chulz came along, of course, and with it, a large number of ex-Royal Navy aircraft handlers who had had extensive experience working with Albion and other aircraft of the Royal Navy off the coast of Yugoslavia during the missions there. So there's an 817 Squadron landing on during RIMPAC 2010. And then, of course, we also had the question of how we were going to make a contribution to what the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines were doing in Afghanistan. Quite separately from our own ADF commitment, we were cycling people through from 2011 on. In fact, I think even earlier than that. And there's pilots Nick Plenty and Kate Manari with this RN Sea King helicopter in Afghanistan's Helmand province in 2011. They are very highly regarded, and they had some pretty hairy adventures, including having to land under gunfire on a couple of occasions. The story told in the book on the loan service chapter identifies just how dangerous it was and how lucky we were not to lose an aircraft in combat. CT Task Force 150 was a major contribution to Operation Manitou made by the RAN, and of course the Fleet Air Arm went everywhere with it. Intention was to conduct interdiction operations in support of deterring terrorism and promoting peace, not just in the Gulf, not just in the Middle East, but also in the Indian Ocean. And there's a photograph of Melbourne having just used a Seahawk to locate heroin, 300 kilograms of it, in a vessel off the coast of Tanzania. So this is keeping good order at sea, intercepting dhows, making sure that what they're carrying is legitimate cargo, not contraband, drugs, ammunition and arms for somebody else's war. One of the things we should mention is the increasing role of women in the Fleet Air Arm, progressively engaged in all roles in the air and on the ground at all rank levels, as you can see from looking at those photographs of those 4 women there. It's true to say now that they are taking over in every way their full responsibility for the operation of aircraft, their flying of aircraft, and the maintenance of aircraft. And I have no doubt that in due course, there will be a woman who ends up as COMFAR, but we're not at that stage yet. The decommissioning of 817 Squadron, a sad day. The Sea Kings had to go at some point. They had given tremendous service over decades, but like all aircraft, their time had come, and there's Paul Mogger at the decommissioning service there, and one of the oldest of the pilots who stood down from naval service on the same day as the aircraft were decommissioned. The fleet review of 2013 was a major occasion for the RAN. Many of you will remember it. It was celebrating 100 years since HMAS Australia, and the first fleet unit had come into Sydney Harbour, and so it was a major opportunity for the RAN to showcase its capabilities. And it so happened that the Spanish ship Cantabria was in harbour at that time, because she was the forerunner to the ship we now have as a supply ship. And we had the opportunity to have one of the squirrels painted up for the 100 and on her flight deck in that photograph below with a mixed crew. 808 Squadron was commissioned to take over from 817, recommissioned, and they of course had the MRH-90 Taipans, which is a Eurocopter and which is about to be phased out of the Fleet Air Arm. Phased out early. It's proved difficult to maintain, but it has been a very reliable and capable aircraft in many ways, and the service that it's provided shouldn't be discounted merely because we're now moving to have an entirely Seahawk, Black Hawk ADF helicopter fleet in the future. There it had its first opportunity shortly after commissioning to go to the aid of the people of the Philippines. Super Typhoon Haiyan hit between November the 3rd and 11th in 2013. Huge area of devastation right across the Philippines. And Tobruk went north for her very last operational engagement before she was decommissioned, and took with her the Taipans, which did an outstanding job of assisting the Philippines Armed Forces to make their contribution to life-saving in the civilian population. June 2014, Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, AO CSC RAN, became the first Fleet Air Arm Chief of Navy since Vat Smith back in 1968. This was a great opportunity for the Chief of Navy of the day to fully understand from personal experience what the Fleet Air Arm's needs and requirements were. And if he didn't start it, but the great project that occurred during his time was the introduction of the Seahawk Romeos to replace the Bravos. There's the Romeo commissioning, 75 Squadron in June 2015. The photograph shows the current commander of the Fleet Air Arm, Commodore David Frost, as the commander of 725. They trained in the US, they learned their business, they learned to use the weapons system of the Romeo in America, and they brought the aircraft home to Australia, and there's the commissioning photograph down below there in 2015. And the Bravos were, of course, then phased out. The MH-60 Romeo is a highly sophisticated combat system designed to employ Hellfire air-to-surface missiles and the Mark 54 anti-submarine torpedo. It is state-of-the-art ASW capability by all standards. And there's a photograph of one there. And of course, then the Bravo was retired, and there's the last flight of the Seahawk Bravo to the Australian War Memorial on the 1st of December 2017. It's in the National Collection, and I'm sure it'll reappear on display when the work being done at the AWM currently is complete. There's CN Barrett, and there's a pilot, not sure which one, and Brendan Nelson there as well in front of the last flight of the old Bravo. The other thing that happened during this period was the decision was made by the Australian government that Nowra was to be the home of all helicopter training. It wasn't any longer to be dispersed around the country according to whether it was Navy or Army pilots being trained. Everyone comes to HATS, the Helicopter Aircrew Training System. The Fleet Air Arm is now the place where you become competent as a helicopter pilot. Having done your flying training in fixed wing, you then convert to rotary wing flying training. And of course, a huge investment in terms of new facilities, hangars, and simulators has gone in there. And it's really state of the art for anywhere in the world, the HATS. And the other thing that this underlies, of course, is the interoperability at sea and ashore that is now quite normal between Army and Navy. You can see there a Chinook on Canberra, and you can see there two long lines of sailors and soldiers standing there at Formation Alpha as either Adelaide or Canberra is moving, probably coming into a port. And that's the number of Army you need in order to make sure that this capability is fulfilled as a landing helicopter dock. Many of those would be, of course, a landing force. And for a landing force, you need the capability to move people either by sea, through watercraft, or of course by Chinook, or indeed by Taipans. The other thing that's happened, of course, is the march of technology means that we now have to think in terms of remote warfare. And there's a remote warfare officer there of the new squadron 822X with a Scan Eagle. It's called X because it's experimental, but Comfar in the talk he gave last week made it very clear that during his time in command of the Fleet Air Arm, he'd like to be able to get that X off and just to make it 822 Squadron as is a regular, normal part of the Fleet Air Arm's business. Two aircraft at the moment, the Schiebel S-100 Camcopter, which is an unmanned aircraft, with considerable potential for replacing manned aircraft, particularly the extreme edge of a task group's need for surveillance. New Year's Eve 2019, HMAS Albatross once again came under threat from bushfires. The newly arrived captain, Robin Phillips, she said, "We were just waiting for that fire front to come up Nowra Hill and get us. Volunteer firefighters protected us, all in the buildings with hoses and a fire truck at each end." It didn't quite get to that stage, but there's no doubt about it that Albatross, surrounded as it is by hundreds of square kilometers of bush, is always vulnerable. And it isn't the only place that's vulnerable, of course. So while the Fleet Air Arm is trying to protect its home base, it's also off doing other things. And here's the bushfire assist at Malakuta in January of 2020. And there you can see I think probably one of the crew looking out from the side of the aircraft from a Romeo out at the scale of the blaze down below. The evacuation of Australian civilians by first Choules and then by Adelaide, mostly done by sea, not by air, I have to say, was the largest Navy and therefore Fleet Air Arm evacuation of Australian civilians since Cyclone Tracy way back in Darwin. So it's a very significant capability, and one that with the weather patterns that we're beginning to see now will always be in use. Navy support to Tonga as recently as January 2022. The sailor with the flag in front of him is in fact a Tongan Australian who was flying over his own homeland, helping out after that underwater volcano and the tsunami which followed back in January this year. And there's a crew there, obviously either probably lowering in some aid from a Romeo. So that brings us more or less up to date. The book had to be sent off for printing around about that point, but 6 months ago. There it is, Flying Stations 2. That only covers the period that I've been talking about from 1998 to 2022, because many of you will know and many of you will have its predecessor volume, Flying Stations was the name of the book, and many people contributed to that. Mike Leon was one of them. There were others as well. He did an excellent job within the constraints of that time and place of recording the story of the Fleet Air Arm up to 1998. And I picked it up from there with the help of many people, imagery specialists, journalists, specialist authors, and it's now available for sale either in the Fleet Air Arm bookshop, which you have to go to and pick it up there for $55, or you can take a photograph of the screen in front of you and have the mobile number of Jade Zhu at the Navy's Anchorage. She's the product and merchandise coordinator, and she will arrange to take your payment over the phone with a credit card and send you a copy of the book, $70, including packing and postage. And for many of you, it would make an ideal Christmas present to yourselves. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I'd be very happy to take any questions at this point.
Good afternoon, Desmond. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Who am I speaking to?
Desmond, it's Graham Lunn here. Thank you very
Yes,
much
Graham.
for that presentation. I just wanted to give one small correction and one observation. The strike on Scharnhorst in 1940, led by Smith as the senior observer, in fact, they lost 2 of those 6 swordfish.
Did they?
Two went down with no survivors from those 2 aircraft.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
fairly high casualty rate for a 6 aircraft sortie.
Yes, indeed.
Now, you
Yep.
also talked about the losses in Korea, the 3 aircrew that were lost in Korea. It's worth remembering that in the same time that Sydney was on that Korean deployment, 8 Australian aircrew died in accident back in
Yes.
Australia and in the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
So it just shows to maintain the capability in those days especially was a high cost in our aircrew.
absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. There seemed to be some sort of a feeling that attrition was to be expected. Well, when you're fighting a war, I suppose you have to think like that, but in peacetime, it was a very heavy price to pay for those young lives. We have a former Fleet Air Arm officer who has a terminal illness, and he's asked to be scattered over the scene where one of his aircrew lost their lives in Jarvis Bay all those years ago.
Yes. I've seen it written in some documents at the time as expected operational wastage.
Yes, it's not a very nice way to describe people, is it?
No.
We wouldn't do it like that now.
Fear variant, Desmond, is
Yeah.
the Americans are putting a lot of attack type, pilotless type of airplane on their carriers and other vehicles. Do you think the future of Australia would be more with pilotless and possibly not just surveillance, but with attack drones on our ships?
Well, I certainly hope so, because at the moment, our any task force that we're attempting to defend from the air isn't going to be defended by the Royal Australian Air Force, because they're never going to get there in time, and they wouldn't be able to stay around long enough if they did. This sort of continental approach that we'll always be somewhere near RAAF cap, it simply isn't possible. The moment we move north of Lombok, we're out of range, all intents and purposes. So we do need unmanned combat air vehicles, UCAVs, in order to do something to protect ourselves. The assumption that our great and powerful friend will always turn up just at the right moment and won't be otherwise occupied is just that. It's an assumption. There's no guarantee that that'll be the case. So we certainly have to use technology to make up for the lack of manned aircraft, strike aircraft flying combat air patrols. Peter.
Steam catapults.
Yeah.
Did Melbourne and Sydney have them from the start?
Yes. Yes, they did. That was the only way you got aircraft into the air in those days. The steam catapult was experimented with right at the end of the Second World War, and Sydney, as far as I know, had one. Melbourne certainly did. I'd have to check on Sydney.
No.
No.
John
Jeremy,
did. Sydney
You'd
did
know
not.
the answer to that. Yeah.
Melbourne did. Yeah.
Melbourne did, Sydney didn't. Yeah,
That's right.
another feature that came in just a bit too late for Sydney. Yeah. Thanks, John. I can see you now, John.
Yes, I've decided to reveal all.
Thank you. And we have the good doctor with us as well. Hello, Neil.
Oh, hello, Desmond. I'm actually calling from Toronto, so I'm very pleased
Oh.
that technology's allowed me to participate. Some of the research I've been doing has included looking at the number of Navy aircraft that people have had to eject out of.
Yeah,
And just people might be interested to know that going through what aircraft have been lost when, that the first ejection was back in 1960, which I think is not too bad, bearing in mind the sea venoms and vampires had been around for a little bit for some years before that. But we ended up with a total of 12 pilots that have ejected from ejection seat aircraft.
yeah,
Just putting that out there.
yeah, indeed.
That doesn't include the casualties, but the people who didn't survive. But I think it sort of says something a bit, adds a bit more depth to the dreadful term wastage that was referred
Yes.
to earlier.
Yes, and my recollection of meeting men who were entitled to wear the Martin Baker ejector seat tie at a mess dinner at Daedalus years ago is that they all had bad backs, which is not too surprising when you consider that the human form is not intended to be ejected through a canopy with a couple of rockets up your ass.
Oh, well, yeah, well, I mean, during the era, there's actually two types of ejection seats. The Skyhawks had zero, I think there were 0 rocket seats. The Sea Venoms actually used a gun with two charges to try and spread it a bit.
Yeah.
The tendency would be that the rate of G onset would basically squash your vertebral spine, so you'd end up being about an inch shorter than what you were.
That's exactly what I detected when these old gentlemen came over to take me by the hand.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
The good, I mean, the good news, that's the bad news. The good news is that the nature of the injury as such is that getting any neurological damage is actually quite unusual unless something else goes wrong.
Good. Hello, Dick Ryan. Dick is ex-Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm and flew extensively as an observer and was observer to the aforementioned Mike Lehan in a Wessex, and they were serving in Glamorgan, and Mike tells me that Dick, as an observer, had never had an opportunity to fly the aircraft solo, though of course he was perfectly competent as a pilot. But Mike gave him the opportunity to do one short takeoff and landing at a remote airstrip somewhere in WA, and Dick, being Dick, took off over the horizon, leaving Mike with extreme vexation as to whether he was going to see his aircraft again and at what point the court-martial was going to start. And Dick came back and did a perfect landing. And as Mike said, you couldn't be angry with Dick. And he was delighted to have him back safe and sound. And Dick is calling in from New Zealand, where I met him when I served in the RNZN. There he is. Dick, you seem to have a trouble unmuting yourself or hearing us, one or the other.
There's just it's quite irrelevant, but talking about steam catapults and in Melbourne, my memory seems to tell me that in 1959, when we did the second repair, we changed the steam catapult in Melbourne using a second-hand one from USS Coral Sea. Probably others would know more. It just seems to be stuck in my mind that we did that. But that's irrelevant. It's a side issue.
John, where did the major repair take place? Alongside it, Garden Island?
No,
She never went up. She went to Cockatoo, did she?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes, we did, but did
Yes.
them both up there. We did
yes,
the 964 one and the 969.
yes,
They were almost
Yes.
identical affairs.
yes. Well, indeed, the truth is, of course, that if first Voyager and then Frankie Evans had gone into the side of Melbourne rather than under her bow, things could have been very different.
Very, very, very different had that happened. But the damage was slightly different second time round, but a bit more damage to the round down of Melbourne. And of course, during that refit, we also fitted the bridle catcher, which became a feature of the fore end for the remainder of the service.
Yeah. Good. Well, Noel and Doug, I'm in your hands again now.
Thank you, everyone. What an amazing comprehensive coverage of the topic, illustrated by just brilliant photos. You couldn't get a better coverage of the topic. So congratulations, Desmond. I'm sure everyone enjoyed the presentation. We had a total of 41 and a lot of them stayed with us despite a bit of an overrun, which is neither here nor there. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for attending. It's very gratifying. Much enjoyed giving it.
Thank you, Des. Thank you very much.